Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 20 of Music is Not a Genre. Do it with me, MxG. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. This week's topic, The Great Producers, Part 6, the 2000s, The Height of TOIGHT. And, of course, I'll explain that title a little bit later on. But first of all, and the only thing I'm going to say here, because the mid-roll takes care of the rest, is please like, share, subscribe, rate, review, lather, rinse, repeat. And if you can or can't do all of that, tell one person about this show. If you know somebody who's into music of all kinds and who is obsessive and incessantly talking about music and interested in music and reading about music and all of that, Music is Not a Genre is for them. So please, just tell one person, email them, post, DM, whatever it is. That kind of sharing, that kind of passing it along is more valuable than almost anything, really. So that's my pitch, and we're going to get right into the topic again. It is The Great Producers, Part 6, the 2000s, the height of TOIGHT. And here it is. Okay. This is Part 6, of course, as it's stated, of my Great Producers series, and we are up to the 2000s. So why the height of TOIGHT? Okay. So there are a few things there. The ubiquity and affordability of new precision plugins allowed producers, engineers, and artists themselves to correct for pitch and rhythm so much in the 2000s that by the end of the decade, there was no room for error. Everything had to be quantized and auto-tuned to the max. That was just kind of the unwritten rule there. And even if you were independent, you had to do that. And that's been passed down, honestly, through the following decade and a half or so. Also tighter than prior was the songwriting across the board. And the reason I say it is because you had people like, Max Martin, whom I will mention later, and other people understanding what it took to craft tightly written pop songs, but also other types of music would take up the cue of that. And also have a bunch of tightly written pop songs. Not that that was the only music in the 2000s, but that was kind of the trend. And, of course, I'll get into that later. And the fact that I say TOIGHT and not tight is finally kind of just a cheeky reference to that era slang. So, 2000s, right? Way longer ago than it should be. Show format, as always, for these. The tech and music changes come first and how they relate to each other. The best producers of the era, because that's what this is about. Conclusions, featured song, and questions. And the bonus extra this week is something I am super excited about. It is a complete history of DAWs. Digital audio workstations, which came of age, really, in the 2000s, even though they had been around for a little while. Every DAW since the 2000s is built on those templates that happened in that decade. That's what the bonus extra at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is about. Please go there and check it out, and it helps to support the show. Sources: Google, Wikipedia, Reddit, soundoflife.com. Disclaimers: I will for sure go into the tech to illustrate how it affected the music, but it's not a tech episode, so there will be things that I will either I will assume some of you know, and those who don't know may not be that interested. If you are interested, you're welcome to look it up because it's not a tech episode. As always, while my producer choices aren't arbitrary, they are incomplete, and they're probably biased to a degree, although I will say my list of producers for every episode of this series is usually relatively comprehensive, and also it represents what was going on fairly well, kind of a wide spectrum there for each decade. Again, most great producers worked in more than one decade. You would hope they did. So what I try to do is include them in the decades in which they made the biggest impact. That holds true here, but you will notice I will mention some producers from previous decades. At least in passing, because their impact was so great for more than one decade. It's a bit of a tweak that I made as I've been going on here in this 6th episode of the series. And so that's the intro. Let's get straight to the body of the first section, tech and music changes. These first 4 tech changes have almost completely defined my recording output of the last 20 years. And if you want to know more about my recording output, go to nickdimatteo.com/music. You're going to find every release there, all the albums, EPs, and singles, compilations, things like that. And these 4 tech changes are DAWs, digital audio workstations. They went mainstream. Programs like Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton Live became central hubs for recording, editing, and mixing. Music production moved into the box, which is a short way of saying you can record and mix everything on a laptop, on your desktop, eventually on an iPad, frankly, and things like that. And you can do it all on your headphones. You didn't need outboard gear of any kind if you didn't want it. And, so that's kind of what that means in the box, mixing in the box. And, of course, the bonus MXtra, the patreon.com/musicisnotagenre will flesh all of this out. It's going to be all about DAWs. The next thing is affordable home studio gear exploded. Audio interfaces, MIDI controllers, DAWs themselves, and decent microphones dropped in price. You no longer needed a major studio to make a competitive record. And that had not been the case prior to that. You had to have money to set up a professional studio in your home in order to do that. And even then, it might not be quite as good. With these DAWs and their abilities, people made, recordings in their homes that ended up on the radio or streaming or whatever. I know this very well because most of my best work has been recorded that way. And still, every week, that's what I'm doing this year. Virtual instruments and VST plugins is the third thing. Software, synths, and samplers replaced or supplemented hardware. Emulations of classic gear, love those, and entirely new digital sounds became widely accessible. And that's one of the important things in this entire decade. Every decade as we've gone on, I have mentioned to some degree the economics of recording. This one, I think the 2000s is where the impact was the absolute greatest. And I say that for 2 reasons. And let me preface this first by saying there had been ways to record at home long prior to this digital era. But again, those recordings were rarely, if ever, good enough to rise to the level of radio, being signed by a label and using that recording itself, streaming, whatever else was happening at the time. And that changed in the 2000s. So, things were super duper 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 affordable. And those things that were affordable were of a high enough quality that if you knew what you were doing, you can compete with the big people, which was a revolution. The beginning of the revolution that's kind of still happening. And the next thing, loop libraries and sample packs. I live by these. I live by these to a degree. I really, really live by VSTs. I 100% live it. Anytime a VST all of a sudden becomes incompatible, which is an issue I'm having now. I'm setting up a live presentation of Rex's album Kite to Camden in its entirety, from beginning to end, all of the tracks with video accompaniment behind and all of that, and I need instrumental versions of them to sing with. And some of those VSTs are giving me issues. It drives me crazy because I do rely on them quite a bit. I have very, very little outboard gear, and frankly, that outboard gear I almost never use. But anyway, this fourth thing, loop libraries and sample packs, pre-made drum loops, instrument phrases, and sound libraries sped up production and influenced stylistic uniformity across genres. And I can't tell you how important these have been to me for some of the things that I do. I try to use loops that are not, blah, blah, precursor, whatever. Like, I make sure that, they're like public domain or something, because and this is a tip for anybody recording out there, if you ever want to shoot for sync licensing, getting your song in a television show or movie, don't use loops that you bought. Don't use loops that have any kind of license to them. Don't use samples at all unless you can afford to actually purchase samples. And even then, that complicates matters. What those sync agents want are one shots, or one stops, which means you own everything. Or if it's you and a partner or whatever, and you don't have to clear anything with anybody. So that's just a tip. But because of those tech innovations, what happened in the 2000s? DIY culture exploded. The tools were affordable. More artists produce their own music. Look, I've been producing my own music for much longer than the 2000s. But it was the 2000s when I really decided by the end of that decade, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, myself with maybe one friend. And that's because of these changes, the ability to afford all of that and to make it sound damn good, as good as anything else. This democratization led to a wider variety of voices as well. People who come from backgrounds there's no way they could afford to go into a studio could now record their own music. But it also increased competition and faster trend cycles, which the trend cycles have now gotten so fast that you can't see them anymore. There's really almost no such thing as a trend in modern music. And that all really started in the 2000s because of this digital revolution. An increasing competition, meaning, of course, just the way the internet is saturated with people releasing their own music. That started even before streaming. It started in the 2000s. These next two tech changes feed into my subtitle for this episode, The Height of TOIGHT. And the first one is pitch correction and vocal processing. Tools like Auto-Tune and Melodyne, and I've used Melodyne. And I use a version of Auto-Tune that just it's called Auburn. It just I make it gently tweak certain backup vocals, frankly, if I want them to mesh, but otherwise don't use it much. But all of that, the ability for me, poor little old me to do it, started in the 2000s. It allowed for both subtle correction and bold stylistic effects like T-Pain, robotic vocals. And then the second thing, improved digital editing and quantization. Timing and pitch could be tightened to near perfection. Grid-based production changed the feel of music. It made it so that there was, if you wanted, there was little to no variation in rhythm. And I don't mean in the pattern of the rhythm, but, a snare wasn't slightly off. It was just damn on the beat. The kick, every single hi-hat, right on the beat. The bass and the kick drum locked in. So sometimes it would make music more precise in a good way. In fact, Rex's first album, Parts and Labor, worked with a drummer, great guy, but loose with the tempo. So in order for us to make the song work with everything else we were doing production-wise, me and my production partner in the drop, we had to quantize the drums. And that was not possible in the previous decade, even the previous 5 years. We were able to quantize them to the point where they still sounded very natural, but they locked in with everything else that we were putting on there. Now, the downside of it is that sometimes that kind of quantization makes things too rigid. So there are times now where I will quantize something, listen to it, and if it sounds too robotic, too rigid, then I'll unquantize it and I might make one or two slight adjustments here or there, but generally keep it natural. And, that happened less in the 2000s. The 2000s were all about, putting it right on the grid, right? Beat, 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 which is why precision became the default. With quantization and pitch correction, imperfections, quote unquote, were optional and used only when preferred for color and quirkiness. Drums hit perfectly on the grid. Vocals were consistently in tune. This led to a cleaner, more controlled sound across pop and hip-hop. But no, it also led to that cleaner, more controlled sound in rock and other forms of music at the time. Of course, you heard it mostly in pop and hip-hop because those, and especially in most of their iterations, demand that precision. But it happened in rock. It happened elsewhere. And yes, the color and quirkiness, there were times, as I mentioned in the 90s, once it became possible, to work digitally in the professional studios, you could, work on things to where you didn't have any mistakes. Then all of a sudden people were like, but I want the mistakes. And that's a part of my process too. And finally, file sharing and digital distribution. It's a quick note here because it's the 2000s. You may think I'm going to start talking about streaming. Yes, it would come into play later in the decade. It did not have much of an influence on music in the decade because it wouldn't really come to fruition until the following decade, which we'll get to in part 7, other than to finally end the loudness wars. That push towards streaming where people were listening to things differently, listening to things lo-fi, really, with crappy headphones or on your phone itself or, little tiny speakers and things like that, couldn't handle the kind of loudness that was being pushed. And if you recall, a week or two ago, I released my bonus MXtra on the loudness wars. So if you want more information on that, please go check that episode out. But this kind of, and I mentioned it in that episode, streaming kind of ended it because they were like, well, we can't, just in the way that things being too bass heavy or loud back in the 70s would make the needle of vinyl skip, etc. Then this was a similar thing for that. It would actually create distortion and what have you on those crappy speakers, frankly. And so the loudness wars kind of tamed and they ended, and then we've now found kind of a happy middle that everyone shoots for. And I mentioned LUFS and things like that in that episode. Go check it out. The rise of MP3s, peer-to-peer sharing, and platforms like Apple's iTunes Store changed how music was consumed, and therefore how it was produced, largely because we could get our hands on whatever we wanted almost immediately, and that kind of broad and deep listening changed how we made music. I mentioned it a little in the 90s episode, but really this is where it happened, to where right at the beginning of the 2000s, if you were thinking, I might want my song to sound like X, or if you were a different kind of artist, I might want to sample X. You just go on one of the, peer-to-peer or LimeWire, FrostWire, and all of that, find those songs and rip them and use them, or use them as an influence. But this is why new sonic palettes emerged. As stated, we could pull from anywhere and do it fairly easily because of plugins that were getting amazing at reproducing the original analog sources. Also, virtual instruments allowed sounds that didn't exist in the analog world, giving some of the music a futuristic feel and adding sounds to the production pantheon that would greatly shape music to come, certainly in the following decade and now. Some interesting ways music was shaped by technology, which, by the way, some of these repeat and also summarize what I've already said. Sampling evolved and sometimes declined, and in a way, it didn't disappear, but because of the legal and financial barriers set forth in the 90s, it pushed producers toward interpolation, which is working around something you want it to sound like instead of, nailing it or recreating it yourself, which meant you still owed, royalties to the original, composer, but it was still cheaper than using a sample. Or just go original compositions that mimicked the sampled styles, like I said. Meanwhile, those who did sample, like Jay Dilla, for example, was a perfect example. Kanye made it a defining artistic signature. So you either had people who were just like no on the samples, or people who were like all of the samples in the 2000s. Another thing, arrangement styles tightened with DAWs. And again, bonus MXtra, patreon.com/music is not a genre, the complete history of digital audio workstations. With those, editing was easy. So songs became more concise. Intros got shorter and hooks came faster. And repetition became a feature rather than a flaw. This is all part of that idea that I mentioned where songwriting became tighter. So there were things that you might have done as a band or as a performer of another kind that you would allow certain, aspects of the song to breathe. In the 2000s, a lot of that breath was pulled out for the majority of the music, mainstream music that we know. There were other kinds of music where people were breathing all over the place. There was a lot of space and all of that. But in the general, in the kind of the mainstream world, which encompasses and certainly encompassed in the 2000s, pop and hip hop and rock and country, hooks came faster, and EDM even. Also, genre fusion accelerated because everything lived in the same digital environment. It became easier to blend sounds. Rock guitars with hip-hop drums, electronic synths with R&B vocals, etc. This blurred genre lines in a way that is now standard. It started in the 2000s. Yes, people say, blah, there's no start to anything. That I consider, and I've said this before in other episodes, the actual start of something in the proto. And the proto is saying that it did exist before, but it wasn't a thing yet. And then it became a thing, and that's when it really started. So there were people before who were certainly fusing genres, for decades. New genres popped up because they fused genres. But in terms of genre fusion, let's say big time, that was the 2000s because of this, because of the technology. And so it did accelerate. And so there was a certain blurring of genre lines that would greatly affect the 2010s and most of the 2020s so far, which, of course, we'll get to in subsequent episodes. The loudness wars intensified, hit a peak, and then settled down. And I talked about this in that bonus episode. Digital mastering tools made it easier to push volume and density, compression. Tracks were designed to hit hard on radio and earbuds, often at the expense of dynamic range. So we know about that. Again, I'm not going to go into that deeply because I did a whole episode on it. Loudness became a central goal. So that's a part of this. The so-called loudness war hit its full stride in the 2000s. Mixes were built to be dense and forward at all times. Heavy compression and limiting were standard. Transients, especially drums, were shaped to feel aggressive but controlled. Now, that to me, in a lot of ways, was one of the positives that came out of this. To be able to compress your drums to the point where you heard every element of it, it kind of took the place of being able to afford going into a studio and recording everything, pristinely on 8 different tracks or whatever it is. So that's the kind of the bonus of being able to use that kind of compression if you use it, gingerly. And obviously the downside is you're going to lose a lot of the dynamic range, as I mentioned in the episode when I talked about all this. Vocals moved front and center and stayed there. With tools like auto-tune and advanced automation, vocals were consistently present, consistently intelligible, not something that happened in the 90s. Volume automation replaced relying purely on compression. So you can automate, the volume of that vocal track to where you didn't want to compress the whole thing. Just pull up one section of it. I do that. I do both. I do a light compressor on the vocal, and then I will go in and tweak certain lines if they don't seem to have the same presence as the rest of the vocal. Stacks, such as doubling a vocal, harmonies, ad-libs underneath, were tightly aligned and blended, which made everything kind of tighter and cleaner. Tight. This was unlike most of the 90s when vocals were meant to blend into the music. I am constantly at war with my 90s and 2000s aesthetics on this when I am producing music. I feel half the time like my vocals are too forward because of that 90s stigma of being too in front of the band. And I feel the other half of the time like my vocals aren't forward enough because of the 2000s saying the vocals need to be front and center. You need to hear them more than anything. Lately, I've found a balance. It still messes with my head. The more you listen to something, the more, you hear flaws, etc., until years pass. And you're like, oh, it was probably good, the whole time. But that idea of, are the vocals a little bit too loud or a little bit too soft, drives me crazy. Effects became more intentional and stylized. Instead of just adding reverb to simulate space, reverbs were shorter, brighter, more controlled. Some of my favorite kinds of reverbs. Delays were tempo synced and rhythmic. I use a plugin in Ableton called Ping Pong all the time. Sometimes for dramatic effect, because something kind of psychedelic trippy that I'm doing. And other times just to give a little punch to the vocal, a little teeny bit of repetition behind there that fades out very quickly. It has a short life span there, short tail. Modulation effects, chorus, phaser, flanger were used as ear candy, just to enhance something and not necessarily as a stylistic statement. More conscious effects choices that weren't necessarily genre specific, as I mentioned. So you could add any number of plugins to a track, and just that single track didn't necessarily change the genre of the music. It just added something interesting to that track. Low end got more controlled. So sub bass and kick drums became more prominent in the 90s, of course, but producers and the technology hadn't fully caught up with how to control that big bottom. Insert your own joke here. EQ carving ensured kick and bass didn't clash. They each had their space, but they were tightly aligned with the quantization. Sidechain compression, especially in electronic music, created the space in the groove. So that's when it goes like loud, in out, in out, in out. I love that effect. I don't use it often, but I have used it on a few of Rex songs. Monitoring improved, allowing mixers to actually hear sub-frequencies accurately. which if you've ever heard anybody with amazing bottom speakers in a car drive by, that's what that is. Deeper, tighter bass that hit hard even on smaller systems. That was important because most people were listening on smaller systems by then and have been ever since. Next thing, editing tightened everything. TOIGHT! DAWs, again, bonus MxG, patreon.com/musicisnotgenre, the history of digital audio workstations. They made it easy to quantize drums to the grid, align vocals, doubles perfectly, which is something that I have relied on a lot, where my older recordings, there was a little slide, let's say, with one vocal, which can be fun. You know, the Beatles said that all the time. There was no big deal. But there are certain times where I want my vocal double, especially if it's at an octave, let's say, to be right on the money and not have to mess with that. Cleaning up noise and timing issues. Mixing and editing started to blur together. Many mix decisions were actually micro edits. And in fact, many mixing decisions were basically pre-mastering. There's very little that I need to do to master anything I do because most of the work's done in the mix. This decade, again, was the peak of tightness in this regard. And while that's made producing so much easier, my ability to create clean and consistent mixes is largely because of what digital audio workstations can do. It's almost all because of that and my, experience. It also took a lot of the humanity out of music. Thankfully, over the ensuing 10 or so years, producers have found more of a balance since then and tend to be precise only when needed. So some more of the humanity has crept back in, but it's always an ebb and flow. Automation became hyper detailed. Instead of static mixes, levels, panning, effects, and EQ could change constantly. That's one of the things. It can be tedious, but I generally enjoy editing in general. I'm a studio rat. I enjoy that mixing, editing, and all of that. So when I need to go into a track and automate one facet of it, whether it's the reverb or the volume or any of those things, I just, double click a point on the grid, raise it, draw the line until I want it to stop, double click again, lower it, whatever. Very easy. It's extremely easy, if time consuming. Choruses lifted not just from arrangement, but from mix moves. And that helps. You want a chorus in general to be louder, unless you're trying to make a point. And you can do that, of course, by singing it louder, by having more instruments, whatever it is. The guitars kick in or some electronic instrument. The drums get, thicker or whatever. But you can also do it by just raising the volumes of certain aspects, of the mix. Transitions were sculpted with precision, with filters, mutes, throws, things that, when I want something to stop dead and not have a hang, I just shut that track off with automation. Once and it's done for the rest of as many times as I want to mix it. When I want to hang, I might still shut it off, but as a fade, or I just let the hang go. This drives producers like me crazy because you can micro edit yourself to death. Still, it's good to be able to make these small changes when you want them. It's better to have the technology and worry about overusing it than not have it and not be able to do it. Translation across systems became critical. People weren't just listening on hi-fis anymore. Earbuds, laptops, car stereos, and early smartphones mattered. Even then, mixes were checked on multiple systems. Something being done in earlier eras with car stereos. I did it with car stereos. But all current sources and ways of listening that we have today were finally established by the 2000s. They didn't quite exist in the 90s. Mid-range clarity became crucial, so songs could cut through anywhere. I have this problem with a lot of podcasts I listen to, that they either don't compress the voice enough, or they don't mix it loud enough, or they put it some kind of weird EQ on, to the point where the voice doesn't cut through. I live in a city. I live in New York City. So when I'm walking around, there are places where it can be noisy, or if you're waiting for a train or whatever it is, you need to be able to hear through that. And so that mid-range clarity and just the general volume is very important. Mixes had to be designed to sound good everywhere, not just great in studios, and that was possible in large part because of that detailed automation. In-the-box mixing took over. Talked about that before. Sort of the big takeaway that encompasses all of the above is that it was in the box. Hardware consoles didn't disappear, certainly, but more mixing happened entirely inside software like Logic and Ableton. Total Recall, you could reopen and tweak mixes instantly. If I didn't have that, I'd be dead. Plug-in chains replaced racks of physical gear. I use plug-in chains on pretty much every track that I record. Revisions, and chain just means more than one plug-in. Revisions became easier and more expected. So you could have so many different changes in a song and different versions of the song. It wasn't that hard to do, especially if you freeze your tracks, which I need to learn to do more often, or just make stems. Like with much of the above, this shifted things toward hyper-perfectionism, so pros and cons. But the bottom line here is that mixing and production in the 2000s became more precise, more aggressive, more vocal-focused, more digital and recallable, more user interface aware. And the more the better with that. It marked the point where a mix stopped being just a balance of sounds and became a fully controlled, highly engineered experience. It gives me tingles to hear that because it's just a place I love to live. You can thank the 2000s for how you hear music today in both tone and range. Also a big takeaway. And also the end of the first half of this episode. And yes, I will keep mispronouncing words. Thanks for hanging so far. Stay tuned for the mid-roll, minute and a half. And we will be back with the great producers of the 2000s right after that. Hey, MxG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdimatteo.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand designed, go to nickdimatteo.com/shop and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdimatteo.com/thesongcoach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdimatteo.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show. All right, we are back, and let's get into it. Great producers of the 2000s. Just like with the music industry in general, due to file sharing and eventually streaming, what was coalescing in the 90s, and I mentioned in that episode I didn't have that many, as many producers, started to splinter. So you'll find that I will be mentioning quite a few more producers in this episode than I did in the 90s, and possibly more than in any decade since. I don't remember. I haven't done a count, but you can check me on that. And maybe, I don't know what the 2010s hold. I haven't researched that yet. Yes, some of these producers will be repeats, so I won't spend too much time on them, but they still deserve a mention for their impact in this decade. I'm going to go loosely by broad genres. Some producers crossed or blended genres, but, I got to put them somewhere. So let's start. And the first genre, broad, loose genre, is rock. Let's get this out of the way first. Props to him for remaining relevant for so long, but Rick Rubin. A minimalist with a near-mythic reputation, Rubin stripped artists down to their essence. His work with Johnny Cash and the Chili Peppers helped bridge genres and generations, emphasizing authenticity over trend. I have a comment about Rick Rubin, which I believe I applied to another producer later on. And I've said this about Rick Rubin before, so I'm going to withhold here, and I will mention it a little bit later. Next one, Paul Epworth brought a cinematic, high-drama sensibility to 2000s indie and pop, working with artists like Block Party. 2005 Silent Alarm blew me away, changed how I listened to music in that decade. I have a t-shirt from that I can't find, so I end up wearing one of my Peace shirts here, which you can get at the store, nickdimatteo.com/shop. Also worked with Adele. Paul Epworth balanced raw band energy with modern production weight. something I highly value. His approach often emphasized dynamic contrast, explosive choruses, rich low end, kind of taking off of some of my favorite 90s producers, helping indie rock feel bigger, more anthemic. By the end of the decade, he was instrumental in bridging indie credibility with mainstream pop and emotional intensity. Pretty huge. Gordon Raphael, someone I didn't know about, was central to the early 2000s garage rock revival, which was huge, especially through his work with the Strokes. His production style emphasized rawness, immediacy, lo-fi texture, often intentionally avoiding the hyper-polish of the era. So he was a contrast to the rest of what was going on that I pretty much talked about in the Tech and Music Changes. By keeping performances slightly rough and sonically constrained, he helped create a sound that felt authentic and urgent, pushing back against the increasingly digital perfected aesthetic of mainstream 2000s production. And you listen to the Strokes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But any of that garage rock. Neil Avron became a defining mixer and producer for 2000s pop punk and alternative rock, shaping the sound of bands like Fall Out Boy and Yellow Card. Huge, especially Fall Out Boy. His mixes are known for clarity, punch, and vocal forward balance. That's what makes it pop punk and not punk. Well, there's other things too. Translating high energy guitar music into something radio ready without losing its edge. Avron helped bring pop-level polish to rock, aligning guitars, drums, and vocals into a tight, compressed, and emotionally direct sound that fit perfectly into the 2000s crossover between alternative and mainstream pop, which was happening a lot in the 2000s. And, of course, again, that tightness shows up. So, next area, alt, indie, electro is what I'm calling it. And the first one, Danger Mouse. He broke through with that mashup project, the Grey Album, which was what? Jay-Z's The Black Album with Beatles' The White Album. Blew me away. I think it was 02, 03. Can't be streamed because he doesn't have the rights to it, but you can find it out there on YouTube, etc. Danger Mouse quickly became a go-to for genre-blending innovation. His work with Gorillaz and Gnarls Barkley balanced experimental instincts with undeniable pop appeal. What's interesting for me about Danger Mouse is that he is sort of like the Rick Rubin of his field, and I promised I would mention this. When he works with an artist I love the production. And when he works with an artist that, then I am not a fan of the production, even though I always respect it. And I frankly generally like Danger Mouse's production style more than Rick Rubin's because I'm more of a glitchy kind of person. And that said, again, the Grey Album stands tall for me. I made a CD copy of it when it came out. And then another producer team, and then eventually a single solo producer. It's called The Drop. Now, you may have heard them before, and that's because that's me. It was me and my partner for many years, Daniel Cousins, and now it's just me. On Parts and Labor, which was Rek's debut album, The Drop played a key role in shaping our early sonic identity, leading to a distinctly 2000s hybrid of electro textures, tight digital editing, and power pop songwriting. That's what I was talking about before, where we had a drummer with a bit of a loose tempo. We made it tight. The approach emphasizes precision and contrast, something I value. Clean forward vocals set against subtly glitchy or synthetic elements with arrangements that feel layered but controlled rather than sprawling. You can hear a push toward DAW native production thinking. Parts are sculpted, aligned, balanced for clarity. It's the first time I worked on anything where I was doing that. I had worked with DAWs before, and you'll hear that in the bonus MxG at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, but I hadn't to this extent. And so the songs ended up with a focused mid-range driven mix that translates across small speakers and headphones. And there was also a willingness to let electronic elements coexist with band elements, helping define Rek's electro power pop blend, noted on our website. In that sense, our contribution to the 2000s, it reflects that shift, not just recording the performances, which were part of it, but designing a sound in the box where digital precision and indie rock could live side by side. That's The Drop. nickdimatteo.com/music if you want to hear more. And you get to see reviews. Scroll down that page, you see reviews of some of my albums. Next area, hip-hop. Some deserving re-mentions, the first couple. Timbaland, known for futuristic rhythms, unconventional sound design. He made beats that felt alien and addictive. His work with Missy Elliott, Justin Timberlake, and Aaliyah defined a sleek, rhythmic pop R&B hybrid that pushed the boundaries of groove and space. Another re-mentioned Dr. Dre, though his peak was earlier, for sure. His output in the 2000s, especially 2001, and Eminem and 50 Cent and all of that, cemented his legacy. His polished cinematic take on West Coast hip-hop set a gold standard for clarity and impact. And let's get to the others. You can't go through the 2000s without mentioning Kanye West. He had an amazing impact on that decade and beyond, no matter what you may think of him personally. Before becoming a cultural lightning rod as an artist, West reshaped hip-hop production with sped-up soul samples and lush orchestration. Albums like The College Dropout and Late Registration expanded what mainstream rap could sound like, blending introspection with maximalist musicality. And here's the thing. Well, everything I just said could be said about this next guy, and in fact, Kanye really wouldn't exist without this next guy, the late, great J Dilla. Where much of 2000s production moved toward precision and gridlock timing, J Dilla quietly reshaped the opposite direction, feel, but digital feel and sample feel. He worked with a Tribe Called Quest before he died an untimely death. He introduced a signature drunk groove, drums that sit slightly off the grid, which is what I talked about before, doing that on purpose, creating a human, almost elastic sense of time. There's a song of mine called The Power of Repetition Everlasting, in which that bridge section of that song does that, kind of slips off the grid. Using samples like the samplers like the MPC, Dilla layered dusty soul samples with loose, unquantified rhythms that felt alive in a way digital production often didn't. Loping, I love that feel. Less commercially dominant, but his influence was everywhere. Neo-soul, alt-hip-hop, even modern lo-fi and jazz-influenced beat sciences. In contrast to the decade's push toward perfection, Dilla proved that imperfection could be the point, and he reshaped how producers could think about groove, timing, emotional depth. And here's the thing. Yes, Kanye was his child, basically. But beyond that, there wasn't much of an influence in the 2000s. It's the fact that he was a pioneer that then influenced the subsequent decades. Lil Jon, as the central architect of crunk, Lil Jon helped define one of the most immediately recognizable sounds of the early to mid-2000s. Productions were built on hard-clipped 808s, rapid-fire hi-hats, simple but explosive synth lines, and chant-driven hooks, prioritized raw energy over harmonic complexity. He produced tracks for Usher, Yin Yang Twins, turned minimalism into a virtue. It's something I need to learn more about, which I'm going to do for the next rec album. The mix was punchy, loud, and designed for clubs and arenas, aligning perfectly with that era's loudness-driven aesthetic. He even influenced pop and EDM. He normalized call and response structures, which, Black Eyed Peas wouldn't exist without him. I think beat drops, hype as production goal. In many ways, Lil Jon pushed 2000s music toward physical impact and immediacy. And I heard him on a podcast a few months ago. Up until then, I had no idea he was such an architect. I thought he was just an artist, not just, a great artist, but an artist. But no, he was an architect. Scott Storch, master of catchy keyboard riffs. He helped define the mid-2000s hip-hop and pop radio sounds. Did hits for Beyonce, Chris Brown, and Fat Joe, and instantly recognizable melodic hooks. He started early on as the keyboardist for The Roots, and then produced to how many people? He worked with a ton of artists and had hits all over the place. Look up Scott Storch. Look up his hit list. Next section, R&B and pop R&B. You have Rodney Jerkins, known as Dark Child. He was a key architect of the R&B and pop from the late 90s into the 2000s. His productions for Brandy and Destiny's Child fused syncopated drum programming with gospel-influenced harmonies and futuristic synth textures. That defined what was going on at that time in that genre. He pushed R&B toward more rhythmically complex and digitally precise sound, which I love this because it's a contrast, and I love contrasts. You had the rhythmic complexity, but it was still digitally precise. And he layered intricate vocal arrangements over tight beats. His work helped define the era's shift towards sleek, high-definition R&B and pop hybrids. A guy that was just recently mentioned as one of the greatest living American songwriters, The Dream, a.k.a. Terius Adamu Ya Gestilde Diamant, also Young Del Nash. He straddled producer and songwriter roles. He crafted sleek, sensual R&B pop hybrids. He's worked with Rihanna, Beyonce, Mariah Carey, also on that list of great American living singer-songwriters, deservedly so. Helped define the late 2000s shift toward atmospheric, melody-driven R&B. It was sort of like polished neo-soul, I guess you could say. Electro dance pop. Stuart Price played a major role in bringing electronic dance music aesthetics to mainstream pop during the 2000s. Worked with Madonna and The Killers. So you can see how I mentioned earlier, rock was taking some of the cues from pop and electro and hip-hop and in the way they produced their music. And here's a perfect example. He fused disco, electro, and synth pop with modern production clarity and with rock at times. Emphasized groove, repetition, layered synth textures, which is huge for me. Huge for my production style, helping set the stage for the EDM pop explosion of the 2010s when it took over. Baby, you're a firework. His mixes feel both retro and futuristic, anchoring dance floor energy with pop song structures. Can't go with 2000s without mentioning the Neptunes, Pharrell Williams and Chad Hugo. Minimal, quirky, and unmistakably rhythmic. They build hits around negative space and offbeat textures. It's very captivating when you're expecting something that doesn't come, and then it's space, and then it hits. It's awesome. Work with Nelly, Clips, who just made a comeback, Gwen Stefani, one of the most distinctive sonic brands of the decade, and Pharrell's subsequent production work on his own with a slew of artists define that tight retro sound. Think of Rock Your Body, Justin Timberlake, 2002. Pop and mainstream pop, you have Xenomania, led by Brian Higgins, that redefined 2000s pop structure by breaking the verse-chorus-verse rulebook, which I think was really coming from EDM, right? Their work with Girls Aloud and Sugar Babies is packed with constant sectional shifts, unexpected hooks, and dense layered arrangements that feel almost collage-like. Instead of building to one big chorus, they often delivered multiple competing hooks, something I do now and then, not always, keeping the listener off balance in a way that felt fresh and hyper-modern. Xenomania proved pop could be structurally experimental without losing accessibility. Their work had more success with artists from outside the U.S. That's why you might not know Xenomania or those artists, but worth mentioning. And I had to mention Linda Perry. She transitioned from an artist to a powerhouse songwriter-producer, specializing in raw, emotionally direct records. Pink and Christina Aguilera brought a stripped-down confessional intensity to mainstream pop. Think of Christina Aguilera's Beautiful from 2002. Centered it on voice and message over gloss, but still had that impact. One of my faves, Mark Ronson, blending vintage soul, funk, and hip-hop sensibilities, became a defining tastemaker of late 2000s pop. Of course, worked with Amy Winehouse on Back to Black. Helped spark a retro soul revival. While his polished kind of a crate digger, meaning a DJ who looks through the crates to see what vinyl he wants to use, that aesthetic made throwback feel modern and commercially dominant. Okay, and of course I'm going to end with this before we get to conclusions. Who did I not mention yet? Max Martin. You got to give it to him for being maybe the most influential of anyone on this list. Already successful in the late 90s, he absolutely dominated the 2000s with a formula that fused pristine melody, tight structure, and emotional immediacy. He's a master, whether you like his songs or not. And I have to say, there are songs and hits of his I love and ones that I'm okay with. And it also depends on the artist, but he's a master. He crafted hits for Britney Spears, Kelly Clarkson, and later on Taylor Swift, helping shape modern pop's DNA. Big time. He helped shape modern pop's DNA to this day, especially the emphasis on huge choruses and streamlined songwriting, tight songwriting, 2000s. Those are the great producers of the 2000s. You can tell me who I missed. Conclusions. Quick public service announcement. Through the decades, the thing that has been the most missing is female producers. And with the exception of Linda Perry, same goes for the 2000s. It's honestly blown me away there haven't been more. And there are certainly female artists who self-produce, and hopefully we'll get to some of those in the 2010s and beyond, or just producers in general. But even to this day, there aren't that many well-known female producers. We're going to see if that changes. What defined the 2000s sound? Disco punk, ultra pop, emo and other adjacent power punk pop, crunk and trap, neo soul, indie and garage rock, and techno infiltrating everything. That's a good summary of what defined that sound. The 2000s were the last transition decade, coupled with the 90s, kind of the flip side of the 90s coin, where the 90s were still mostly analog with digital quickly bleeding in everywhere. The 2000s were then mostly digital with analog slowly seeping away. And in both decades, you had a healthy mix of those throughout genres, at least from the mid-90s on. Let's say the early 90s, not so much. The 2000s did it two ways. Number one, genres combining digital and analog like disco-tinged rock bands or rock-flavored electropop. And number two, with the blending, a hard split between garage rock and more techno side of things. So you had the first one where things were combining, and then the second one where things were splitting. That split would define the next decade, the end of this decade and the next decade, because one of those things, rock and electro, would, in terms of mainstream culture, die out more or not. Making a comeback in mainstream culture never went away, by the way, for you rockists who say rock is dead. Two examples of these forces. Genre boundaries started collapsing. Hip-hop production techniques, looping, sampling, drum programming infiltrated pop and rock and R&B. Producers like Timbaland and the Neptunes made rhythm and texture the focal point, even in pop songs, something I enjoyed doing most of the time. And this is largely because the immediate availability of any song and artist you wanted to hear allowed producers and artists to pull influences from anywhere and everywhere, further blurring genre lines. Something I said before is worth repeating. The difference, however, between 2000s retro and retro of the last 10 years, not all of it, but most of it, is that it sought to fully reinvent its influences. Think of Mark Ronson. Whereas later music has been doing interpolations to the point of even the common listener being able to pick out an artist or song the influence cop. I can't tell you what's the song Express Yourself, Madonna, right? And that Lady Gaga song, it's Born This Way. Almost the same song. Polish versus personality tension. On the one end, you had ultra clean, radio-ready pop, driven by Max Martin and people like him. On the other, you had raw, stripped-down authenticity, like Rick Rubin or Linda Perry, and both thrived simultaneously. Hook-driven songwriting-dominated songs became tighter, more immediate. Big choruses, memorable melodic motifs, and rhythmic hooks were prioritized, partly because of how music was being consumed. Or early digital downloads and eventually streaming. And that's across the board. One reason I love this era so much, and I really did, was that it retained a lot of the sonic palette of the full 90s from beginning to end, the grunge era and the post-grunge era, the first half and the second half. It took all of that. It integrated those halves very well and added a tightness of structure that was sometimes missing in the 90s that still allowed for personality. I mean, that's mastering the form. To me, the rise of the producer as brand. Producers weren't just behind the boards anymore. They were brands. Think of Pharrell Williams or Danger Mouse, and even, honestly, Rick Rubin to a degree, whose sonic identity was recognizable across projects. While I've talked about versions of this in every decade, this is the decade when that idea started to truly dominate. Also, many of these producers were the principal songwriters. So it's as if the artists were just their avatars, carrying forth their sounds and ideas, creations. The garage rock, indie rock revival was huge in the 2000s. It's often framed as a backlash against the era's hyper-polished digital production. But in reality, as I said, it was just as shaped by the technological shifts. The Strokes, the White Stripes, emphasized rawness, minimalism, and analog feel, working with Gordon Raphael and other producers like that to capture performances that felt immediate and unfiltered. But at the same time, you had indies like MGMT, LCD Sound System, The Killers, who were folding in electronic textures and drum machines and synths into that indie rock framework. It was not a rejection of 2000s production. It was a reinterpretation of it. Lo-fi aesthetics, lo-fi in the old definition, coexisting with DAW-based editing and electronic layering. Again, bonus MXtra, patreon.com/music is not a genre, digital audio workstations in their entire history. This hybrid approach helped redefine rock as something that could be both gritty and synthetic, indie and mainstream, setting the stage for the indie electronic and dance rock movements that would carry into at least the first part of the 2010s. Hybrid workflows became the norm. Producers were no longer choosing between studio and computer. They were blending both. You'd see someone like Kanye sampling vinyl and arranging it in the box, while someone like Mark Ronson tracked live horns, but edited and polished them to often make them sound like they were a sample. And that was one of the interesting things for me this decade. That's something that has influenced me a lot, is how you can have those two ideas coexisting. Also, there was a time early on when I was still working in studios where I would take a mix home and work on it and then go back to the studio. That wasn't something that you could do in previous decades. Not really. So this is a fun section. My favorite producers of the decade. And here we go. The Neptunes were probably my first 2000s producer love. That minimalist, vaguely 80s sound was as new as it was retro. So my first favorite producer of the decade, the Neptunes. Second, I can't deny that I loved Kanye's production aesthetic. I can't deny it. And I can't deny that, again, I can't say Kanye without saying Jay Dilla. So a real favorite there too. I have to admit, there's a lot of Max Martin's work that I've liked. Again, true master of his particular form and has to be mentioned. And I would say because I like so much, and because I've been so influenced by that kind of, it was a version of power pop. In a way, I have to say he's one of my unexpected favorites from the decade. But my stealth top two favorites from the decade, Mark Ronson for his mix of electro, rock, and pop, and knowing how to bring in retro elements without being derivative. I've always loved Mark Ronson's work. If you like the big Bruno Mars hit, Uptown Funk, it's because you like Mark Ronson. One reason, anyway. And then my other favorite, Paul Epworth, a name I didn't know until I did this research, because it turned out he worked with some of my favorite bands of the time, Block Party, The Futureheads, The Rapture, Florence and the Machine. I think if I can, I'm going to, solicit him and work with him for the next Rec album. And I have to mention The Drop, my team. My work has pulled from all of the people on this short list here in the favorites section. Please go to nickdamadio.com/music and check out The Drop's work. Though musically I am a child of many decades and never stop absorbing new ideas, in terms of how I record and produce and tailor my work flow, I am 100% a child of the 2000s. True fact. Speaking of how I record, a featured song. Though I've been a producer my entire life, I didn't fully take charge of the recording and producing process till the 2000s, as I mentioned before. That's not entirely true because I did tons of 4-track recording before then. But again, those were demos. They couldn't be put on the radio or streamed. Why? Saved a ton of money on studio time and tech. That's one reason why I did it. DAWs had become super affordable and easy to use. I learned at the hands of a couple of people, William Moses, who inadvertently schooled me on Logic during the Metro Grand sessions, and Daniel Cousins, who was one half of The Drop for a while and co-produced my music for nearly a decade, taught me how to use Ableton, and I have never looked back. You'll hear far more about this. Again, final mention here in the bonus MXtra on patreon.com/music is not a genre on digital audio workstations. So the song I'm choosing this week is one from Rec's debut album, Parts and Labor, and is one of 2 bonus tracks on the album. Bonus meaning the album proper ends with the song It's Like This, and then 2 more tracks come. The second of those 2 tracks, the one at the end, which is sort of like the hidden track, is Rec's most streamed song to date on Spotify, at least, and that is our cover of the theme song to Aqua Teen Hunger Force. Do I wish Rex most streamed song was not a cover? Sure. But we also know that covers are hugely popular. So thank you for listening to that. The other bonus right before that track was Come a Little Closer, Scared Boy remix. And as it says so, it's a remix of an earlier song. It bridges the gap between my Nick years when I was a solo artist and my Rec years, showing how one of the best songs from the Metro Grand sessions, Come a Little Closer, could be repurposed and remixed to reflect Rec's direction on parts and labor. It's moody, ambient, glitchy, funky, techno, and more or less follows the structure of the original song. It's about a mercurial guy who's afraid he's scaring away his love and is trying to tell her that it's him, in fact, who is scared. And it's okay for his love to come closer. Come a little closer. As always, please stream it. Stream it 1,000 times. And Bandcamp it too. Bandcamp even better. And please stay tuned for it right now, right after these. Questions. What music from the 2000s did you listen to? Did you notice how different the bass standard for music recording had become between the 2000s and the 90s in just a few short years? Were you into recording yourself? And if so, did you get into it because it was so cheap and easy to access? Bet you did. How do you think 2000s music measures up to music before and after? And how did it influence music in the 2010s and today? I'd love to know your answers to all of these questions and more because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening, and I will talk to you next week.
I'll show you how good I can be. If you just come a little closer. If you just come a little closer, I'll make you safe in spite of me. I'll give you everything you need. Just come a little closer. If you just come a little closer. There's a scared boy inside of me.